Let's talk about a war that everybody has an opinion on and almost nobody wants to look at clearly. Not the war as it's described on the evening news with its neat little maps and its confident predictions, but the war as it actually is. Messy, grinding, and shaped by forces that have very little to do with courage or values, and almost everything to do with power, logistics, and the limits of what either side can actually sustain. I want to walk through where things stand between Russia and Ukraine right now because there's been a burst of activity in the past few weeks that a lot of people are reading the wrong way. And I think it's worth slowing down and asking what's really going on. Start with the drones. Ukraine has been sending waves of them deep into Russian territory, into Moscow, into Crimea, hitting refineries, hitting military infrastructure, occasionally rattling windows near the Kremlin itself. On June 18th, Ukraine struck the Gazprom Neft Moscow oil refinery in what analysts described as the most significant deep strike of the entire war, triggering a massive explosion and sending thick black smoke billowing over the Russian capital from a facility that produces roughly a third of the Moscow region's fuel. The Russian Defense Ministry reported intercepting 555 Ukrainian drones in a single overnight period around the same week, with almost 200 intercepted approaching the capital alone. The instinct in a lot of Western commentary has been to treat this as evidence that the tide of the war is turning. Look, they're saying, Ukraine can reach the Russian capital. Doesn't that prove Russia is losing? In 30 years of analyzing how wars actually progress, here's the honest answer. Damage is not the same thing as decisive. These strikes are real. The fuel restrictions now being implemented at gas stations across Crimea and parts of St. Petersburg as a direct consequence of sustained Ukrainian deep strike operations are real. The disruption to Russian military logistics documented by Western intelligence is real. But the drone campaign is doing something specific, and understanding what it is actually designed to do matters enormously for reading where this goes next. These strikes are not designed to win the war outright by destroying Russia's military capacity from the air. They are designed to impose compounding costs on Russia's economic infrastructure and domestic confidence to make ordinary Russians feel the war in a way they haven't had to before, and to improve Ukraine's negotiating position whenever real talks eventually happen. This is a war being fought with one eye on the battlefield and the other eye on the bargaining table. The drone campaign belongs mostly to that second eye. The Sufan Center put it precisely. Ukrainian strikes have added domestic stress inside Russia, helped crack the Kremlin's veneer of invulnerability, and advance Kiev's broader wartime agenda. But these effects do not on their own guarantee a strategic shift. So then the question becomes whether there's a limit, whether there's a point at which Russia stops absorbing these strikes and decides to answer them in a way that changes the character of the conflict. Nobody can draw that line with precision, and anyone who tells you they know exactly where it sits is guessing. But if you actually listen to the language coming out of Moscow, rather than the language coming out of Washington and Brussels about Moscow, there's a pattern. The tone shifts from irritation to something closer to a warning the more these attacks accelerate. And that word accelerate is not incidental. It shows up in the language of Russia's adversaries too. At the recent G7 summit in France, the declaration that came out explicitly promised to accelerate the development of long range strike capability for Ukraine and to intensify economic pressure on Russia. The United States signed on to that statement. Read it from Moscow's chair for a second. It isn't a private off the record leak. It's a public communique from the world's seven largest economies, publicly committing to intensifying a campaign aimed at the Russian economy and Russian territory. That is not a small thing, and it is not how you would describe the behavior of a neutral party trying to end a war. which raises an uncomfortable possibility that gets waved away far too quickly in polite conversation. What happens if Russia decides to respond not inside Ukraine, but outside it? What if the retaliation for a sustained campaign against the Russian interior isn't another artillery barrage in Donbass, but something targeting the supply infrastructure that makes Ukraine's long range capability possible in the first place? People flinch from that scenario because it sounds extreme, but it's worth sitting with the logic rather than the discomfort. The purpose of an escalatory response like that would be coercive, not conquering. It wouldn't be about seizing territory. It would be about changing the political calculus in European capitals and in Washington by making continued support for Ukraine carry a cost that domestic publics and legislatures feel directly. Whether Russia would actually do this is a separate question from whether the option exists in strategic thinking in Moscow. And every piece of available evidence suggests it does exist in their thinking, even if it hasn't yet been exercised. Now, consider what actually happened over Moscow just recently. 47 drones shot down in a single night as they flew toward the Russian capital, according to Moscow's own mayor, several of them in the airspace around the symbolic heart of the country. From a purely military standpoint, hitting Moscow's airspace makes almost no sense as a strike against operational capability. It doesn't destroy a tank, it doesn't cut a rail line. What it does is generate a sense of vulnerability at the center of power. And the honest question worth asking is whether anyone seriously believes this brings the Russian leadership to the negotiating table in a conciliatory mood, or whether it does something closer to the opposite, hardening domestic resolve, feeding a narrative of a nation under siege that has no choice but to keep fighting. Here's what's been circulating in Western commentary for roughly the past month. And I want you to notice how convenient this story is for the people telling it. The narrative goes that Ukraine has quietly turned the tide, that the Russian economy is buckling under sanctions and energy infrastructure strikes, that there's real internal resistance building against the Russian leadership, and on the actual front lines, that Ukrainian forces have stalled the Russian advance and might even be starting to push back. Stack all of that together, and the conclusion practically writes itself. Now is the moment to double down, to widen the drone campaign, to send more long range weapons, because Russia is on the ropes and a better deal is finally within reach. That story deserves real scrutiny, not because skepticism is fashionable, not because Russia's position deserves sympathy, but because the story needs to match the actual evidence on all three of those pillars. On the economic front, the evidence is genuinely mixed. Bankruptcies of small and medium sized enterprises in Russia have been on the rise, and fuel restrictions are visible at gas stations in multiple regions. That's real stress. At the same time, Russia has repeatedly demonstrated an ability to adapt under sanctions pressure, and the Russian economy has not collapsed in any of the previous rounds when that outcome was confidently predicted. The Sufan Center's most recent analysis noted that both sides remain locked in a years long war of attrition in which Ukraine's tactical successes will matter most if they can be translated into sustained battlefield pressure. Cautious optimism is warranted, certainty is not. On the battlefield, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, two major cities in eastern Ukraine that the original Russian military timeline assumed would fall quickly, are still not under Russian control. Western analysts have increasingly pointed to Russia's slowing rate of advance as a meaningful indicator. NATO Secretary General Rutte, arriving in Kiev recently for an unannounced visit, said that Russia is growing desperate as it faces military and economic difficulties. Those are real assessments from real people with access to real intelligence. And Ukraine's drone advantage has genuinely expanded in ways that have forced Russia to protect a wider range of targets across a much larger geographic area than it originally anticipated having to defend. At the same time, Russia retains a significant escalation advantage through its arsenal of tactical nuclear weapons, which it has threatened but not yet used. Ukraine remains heavily dependent on US made Patriot interceptors to defend against Russian ballistic missiles. And Russia has demonstrated the ability to launch larger and more complex strike packages, combining ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses when it chooses to escalate its own campaign. The honest picture is not one of imminent Russian collapse. It's one of a grinding attrition war in which Ukraine has genuine and recently expanded advantages in the deep strike domain, while the fundamental battlefield balance remains contested rather than resolved. Anyone selling you either version of certainty, Russia is about to crack or Ukraine is about to lose, is selling you something that the evidence doesn't yet support. Now, layer onto this something that got surprisingly little attention relative to its significance. After what was described by many observers as a consequential diplomatic summit between American and Russian leadership, the Russian side recently indicated that nothing concrete had actually been settled there. Think about that carefully. An enormous amount of diplomatic mythology built up around that meeting. A sense in some Western commentary that a genuine opening for peace had been created. And the Russian characterization is that the substance was far thinner than the symbolism suggested. The more useful way to think about that meeting isn't in terms of whether documents were signed. It's in terms of what the Russian side believed it represented at the time and what it believes it represented now. There appears to have been a period after that meeting when Moscow genuinely tested whether the American administration wanted to find a way to wind the war down, operating in something resembling good faith toward that goal. What seems to have changed more recently is a Russian judgment that this window has closed, that Washington has aligned itself fully with the European and Ukrainian position rather than functioning as any kind of broker, and that the shared goal of the Western coalition, accelerating pressure on Russia until it accepts terms it has repeatedly rejected, is now the operative framework, regardless of what individual conversations may have suggested. Whether that judgment is accurate or convenient doesn't matter as much as the fact that it's clearly shaping decisions in Moscow, because policy gets made based on perception, not on what's objectively true. This connects to something that deserves to be said plainly because the coverage consistently tiptoes around it. The idea that the United States is functioning as a mediator in this conflict, a detached, even handed party trying to bring both sides to a fair resolution, does not survive even a cursory look at the record. G7 summits committing to accelerating Ukraine's long range strike capability, intelligence support for operations that wouldn't be possible without it, the sustained flow of weapons and training that preceded the actual invasion by years. That is not the behavior of a bystander. That is the behavior of a party that made its choice well before the war began and has intensified that choice consistently since. You don't have to take a position on whether that involvement is justified to recognize that it is involvement, not neutrality. And calling it mediation distorts every subsequent conversation about how the war might end. There's also a speech worth pausing on, a recent address by the Russian president to a room full of newly commissioned military officers, delivering a message that was blunt about the possibility of confrontation with Europe. It would be easy to read that as pure aggression, the mask slipping to reveal expansionist ambition. but I think that reading misses something important about how this is actually being framed on the Russian side, and understanding the framing matters, even if you find it self serving. The consistent position coming out of Moscow, stated repeatedly since before the invasion, is not a desire to push tanks toward Western European capitals. It is and has always been centered on one specific outcome: preventing Ukraine from becoming a forward deployed military platform on Russia's border within a Western alliance structure. That was the stated red line before the war. It remains the stated red line now. What has shifted is Russia's belief about whether European governments view the situation the same way. If the dominant view in major European capitals is that this is an implacable expansionist power that must be confronted and stopped by force, and if European rhetoric and military planning increasingly reflect that belief, then from Moscow's vantage point, a broader confrontation starts to look increasingly likely, regardless of what Russia's actual territorial intentions are. And if you believe something is coming, regardless of what you do, the rational response is to prepare for it. That's the logic behind the speech. Reasonable people disagree sharply about how much of that perception is genuine and how much is convenient justification for a military buildup that was already underway for other reasons. Put all of these threads together, and a fairly coherent picture emerges, even if it's an uncomfortable one. A war that began in large part over the question of alliance expansion has evolved into something with its own momentum, a contest being fought simultaneously on the battlefield and in the domain of perception, where drone strikes matter as much for the story they tell as for the damage they inflict, where summit meetings generate diplomatic mythologies that outlive the actual substance of what was agreed, and where each side increasingly frames the other not as an adversary to be managed through negotiation, but as an opponent whose strategic position must be permanently degraded. That is a genuinely dangerous place for a conflict to be. Wars that are about permanently defeating an enemy rather than managing a dispute tend not to end through negotiation. They tend to end through exhaustion, or they escalate until someone crosses a line that nobody originally intended to cross. Neither of those outcomes is the one any government in this conflict is publicly advocating for. But both of those outcomes become more likely the longer the current dynamic of escalating pressure and hardening resolve continues without a genuine diplomatic opening that gives both sides a face saving path to reduce conflict. None of this means predictions are easy or that anyone has a monopoly on where this goes. Wars consistently humble people who claim certainty about their trajectory, but there are a few things worth holding on to as this continues to unfold. First, deep strike campaigns and headline grabbing operations are not the same thing as decisive battlefield outcomes. Ukraine's expanded drone capability is genuinely significant. It is not on its own a path to ending the war on favorable terms without also shifting what's happening on the actual front lines. Second, public declarations of accelerating support made by an entire alliance structure are not neutral acts, and the side receiving that pressure responds to the cumulative pattern, not to the individual justifications offered for each new step. And third, the language a government uses to justify its own military preparations, whether that's encirclement or defending freedom or preventing expansion, deserves honest scrutiny rather than automatic acceptance or automatic dismissal. Understanding what the other side actually believes it's doing is the prerequisite for any policy that doesn't make the situation worse. The honest, unglamorous truth is that this war is not close to over. The recent wave of deep strikes, the G7 commitment to acceleration, and the hardening rhetoric on both sides are signs of a conflict settling into a longer and more dangerous phase. not a sign that anyone is close to a breakthrough. Ukraine has genuine momentum in the deep strike domain right now. Whether it can translate that into political leverage before exhaustion sets in on both sides is the central question this conflict has always been asking. Nobody has answered it yet. Anyone who tells you they have is selling you something. The far more useful posture, uncomfortable as it always is to keep watching the actual balance of forces. Keep questioning convenient stories, regardless of which side they flatter, and stay alert to the moment when the rhetoric about escalation stops being rhetoric and starts becoming policy. That's the moment that actually matters, and it's the one too much of the current coverage is still looking past. What do you think? Does Ukraine's expanding deep strike capability translate into real negotiating leverage before the broader war of attrition grinds both sides toward exhaustion? Or does the current escalation trajectory lead somewhere that nobody in Washington, Brussels, Kiev, or Moscow actually wants to end up? Let me know your read in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this one is moving faster than most people realize.